holding on to that rock, holding on to the rock. And the good news is that rock is holding on to us. And last week we talked about adversity. And we talked about the Apostle Paul. We were in 2 Corinthians. And Paul's whole experience with the Corinthian church was filled with adversity. Paul's life had been filled with adversity. You know, Jesus told Ananias that I'll show him how much he must suffer for my name's sake. And so Paul was certainly no stranger to hardships and trials and adversity. And somewhere along the line, Paul was shaped and molded and strengthened, and God used him as a shining light for the gospel. And he stands as a great example of one of how to live one's life in the midst of adversity. And last week, we shared some thoughts from the Scriptures. When we face adversity, it mattered what kind of faith Paul had. What kind of faith that Paul possessed mattered. It made the difference in how he would handle and approach and view adversity, trials, difficulties, whether it be with people or whether it just be with his circumstances. Those circumstances that happen that you can't explain, that are hard and difficult. The Apostle Paul knew what those were, and having the kind of faith that mattered is what made the difference. And of course, he quotes directly from the Psalms, and we talked a little bit about the Psalms and the psalmists, those experiences, those vivid variety of experiences throughout the Psalms that are filled with all kinds of flavors of experiences, from hardships and sorrows and anger and rage to joys and peace and contentment. All those emotions, all of those perspectives you find in the Psalms. And the Apostle Paul talked about, our faith being like the psalmist when he said. And so that type of faith that continues to believe against all the odds, it continues to hold on, knowing that one greater than ourselves is holding on to us, that we can continue on, that we can continue to believe even in the midst of severe adversity. That kind of faith matters and makes the difference. First of all, faith that our adversity has a purpose, we said last week, that there is a reason, that God is working behind the scenes of our adversity. And Paul discovered, I believe, that whenever we often see the things that we often see as setbacks, God uses as setups to display His glory, because when it all gets down to it, it's all about Christ being honored and glorified through our lives. We are His vessels. But all of this is dependent upon perspective. It's all dependent upon perspective. Isn't it amazing how different people's perspectives can be so at almost opposite ends whenever we see the same thing? People have a different perspective. I was talking to somebody on the phone yesterday, and I was explaining something, and they said, "Well, I don't see it like that. I see it like this." I'm thinking, how do you see it like this? Even after I've explained it to you, what I mean by it and that type of thing, how can you still see it differently? Isn't it amazing how people can have different perspectives that are so different and opposite of one another? Well, the Apostle Paul had a perspective, and it was fueled by faith. For he says in verse 7 of 2 Corinthians chapter 5, we live by faith and not by sight. We live by faith, literally, for we live through faith. For through faith we walk, not through sight. We do not live our lives as Christ followers. We are not to live our lives based on what we physically can see 100%. But we walk through faith. When faced with adversity, what kind of perspective did Paul have, the apostle have? Well, if you're taking notes this morning, you could write this down. His was an eternal perspective. His eternal perspective matters. His eternal perspective made the difference in his life and how he handled adversity. Faith, a kind of faith that stands firm, that is unmovable, that is unshakable, a faith in the eternal purposes of God, a faith that rests in the eternal perspective. That matters. That makes a difference. Let's look at what he says in verse 16 of chapter 4 of 2 Corinthians. We never give up. We never give up. Our bodies are gradually dying, but we ourselves are being made stronger each day. And these little troubles. Now, Paul is there because I underlined that little. Remember who said this? The Apostle Paul. He did not know little troubles. He knew huge troubles, multiple troubles. From our perspective, right? When we judge him from the outside, how in the world does he go through what he goes through? And again, that's what some of the Corinthians couldn't grasp, but they couldn't figure out. Man, this guy is constantly getting in trouble. Is he really legit? I mean, is he really for real? Because if God was really with him, why does he keep getting thrown in jail? Why does he keep going through all this suffering? Isn't that what we judge our circumstances by? We go through hardships, we go through sufferings. Well, that person must not be living for God, or if we're taking it upon ourselves. Well, God, what did I do that's so wrong, that's so bad, that I'm going through all this? We judge our outward and external circumstances. We walk by sight and not by faith. Paul says these little troubles. How could Paul say that? Because of his perspective. He says these little troubles are getting us ready for an eternal glory that will make all our troubles seem like nothing. Another version, it says, outweighs them all. And that perspective and that language, you get that imagery of the scales. You see the scales at teeters, like this. And they would often use scales back in the ancient days to measure out the worth of something. If you had produce or something that you were buying, they would put that on the scale, and then they would put the weights on the other side until it got level, and that based on what those weights were worth and that type of thing, that would determine how much your thing that you're buying cost. And so whenever we see our problems, it's heavy and it sinks all the way to the bottom. It tips the scale. But when we begin to add to our perspective an eternal weight, and we keep adding on that, we become fixated on the blessings of those things that are awaiting us, our eternal inheritance, and all that is going to take place in eternity. We continue to stack eternal perspectives on that, and that burden gets lighter and lighter and lighter until it's so light it outweighs, our eternal perspective outweighs them all. Things that are seen, our adversities, don't last forever. Isn't that good news, church? They don't last forever. But things that are not seen are eternal. That's why we keep our minds on the things that cannot be seen. We keep adding eternal perspectives onto our circumstances and throughout our lives. And we'll discover that the burdens that seem, from some person's perspectives, very heavy and weighty, to us, they become lighter and lighter, and that eternal perspective outweighs them all. But no doubt, we long. How many of you long for that day? Not very many of you? I don't know about you, I long for that day. I long for the day when I cast off the burdens of this life and I enter into my eternal home. The Apostle Paul said it this way in verse 8, we are confident, I say, and would prefer to be away from the body and at home with the Lord. Doesn't home sound great? To be home with the Lord. But you've also heard that saying, so heavenly minded, no earthly good. I think sometimes we can be pretty selfish about heaven sometimes. We get so focused on heaven. Oh, it's going to be great when we all get to heaven. We even sing the song, when we all get to heaven, that we become so focused on our eternal joys that we stop focusing on what we're supposed to be doing here, right now, while we take breath, while we live. Apostle Paul, he said from his eternal perspective wasn't self-centered, but his perspective dealt with mission and the purposes of God, not only in eternity, but even here and now. He says in Philippians chapter 1, but if I live, I can do more fruitful work for Christ. So I really don't know which is better. I am torn between two desires. For I long to go and be with Christ, which would be better by far for me. But for your sake, it is better that I continue to live. And so are you torn today? Or are you just anxious to get out of this old earthly body and discard it and be clothed with immortality? That's certainly going to be a grand old day and a great time when we all get to heaven. But the Apostle Paul, as we look at his example of how he faced adversity, he was torn. You would think all he was going through, I just can't wait to get out. I can't wait to get to heaven, get out of this place and get to heaven, go home, and I don't have to deal with any of this stuff anymore. But that wasn't the tenure of his life. That's not what we're seeing from his life. We see this struggle. Yes, I want to be home with the Lord, but yes, it would be far better for you. And so, what does it all boil down to? If you're taking notes, you can write this next point down. And having an eternal perspective that matters, it means that regardless of life circumstances, pleasing God is what matters most. Regardless of whether I'm here in the body or I am home with the Lord, pleasing God is what matters most. Regardless of what my earthly circumstances are, whether they're good times or bad times, whether they're difficult times or fun times or easygoing times, pleasing God in all areas of my life is what matters most. Using all the time, all the opportunities that God gives me to please Him is what matters most. So we make it our goal to please Him, whether we are at home in the body or away from it. And this applies to every area of our lives, not just if I live here or live in heaven, but in all circumstances, especially in our relationships, in our everyday dealings with people. Well, how do we begin to please God? Well, first of all, to live this life that is pleasing to God, as we follow Paul's line, as we continue to follow Paul through 2 Corinthians, we get this principle. If you want to live a life that's pleasing to God, refrain from living in judgment of others. Refrain from living in judgment of others. Look at verse 10. For we must all stand before Christ to be judged. We will each receive whatever we deserve for the good or evil we have done in this earthly body. Now, what's an emphasis there? We. So often when we're judging somebody, we don't focus on ourselves, we focus on whoever we're judging, whoever we're casting judgment upon. Apostle Paul wanted to make it clear, and of course, interesting how you can read, it's important to be a good reader, how you can read the Scripture, give those points of emphasis, it highlights the meanings and the truth behind it. The Apostle Paul was again in defense of his ministry because people were judging him as illegitimate, as not being authentic in his ministry, that his apostolic authority wasn't really all that it was cracked up to be. He was defending his ministry, and it is not only Paul's purpose to safeguard himself from passing undue judgment upon the Corinthians, but he also wanted to challenge them on the dangers of living in judgment of him as well. Because when we live in judgment of others, we rarely see our own faults. And the Apostle Paul wanted to make it vividly clear. For we must all stand before the judgment seat of Christ. Every single one of us are going to stand before Christ and be judged. Paul says in Romans 2, God will judge men's secrets through Jesus Christ. We often judge by outward appearances. And because of that fact, because we often judge ourselves, judge others on outward appearances, we kind of play that to our advantage, because that means that we can sometimes put a facade up in our own lives. We can fool other people. And so that we can almost help guarantee how people will judge us. And if we just present ourselves in a certain way, we can fool them, but the truth of the matter is we will all stand before Christ to be judged. God will judge men's secrets through Jesus Christ. We live by faith, not by sight. How often we judge others at face value. We judge the whole of a person by what we see on the surface. Faith in this context implies, when we're dealing with other people, it implies a choice that gives the other person the benefit of the doubt, that there's a greater context than what we are seeing that has shaped and continues to shape that person's life. Because unless we really, really know someone, we don't have enough information to really understand the true nature of a person's heart. It requires going deeper. Just like the old illustration of the iceberg. You only see the tip of the iceberg, but boy, if you go down deeper and look underneath the surface, you'll see a lot bigger context that's at work there. What secrets or hidden hurts or wounds or influences do we possess that flow from our lives and express themselves in certain behavioral patterns? What hurts or wounds, what strongholds have been built up in our lives even from years ago, from our past, that impact us today? And yet, sometimes we stand in judgment of others, and there's all these secrets in our own lives. We are all accountable to one person, that is Christ. No one will escape this judgment. All will have to answer for how they lived their lives. The Apostle Peter, after Jesus was risen from the dead, and he was on the seashore with Peter and the other disciples, Jesus was having a heart-to-heart talk with Peter about feeding his sheep and, allowing Peter to affirm his love for him. And all of a sudden, Peter gets distracted. Isn't that just like us? When the Lord is trying to tell us something, we get distracted by what somebody else is doing. Jesus is talking to Peter, and Peter says, "Oh, but Lord, yeah, I love you. Yeah. But what about him?" Right? What about him? What's he going to be doing? And Jesus says, "What is that to you, Peter? You do what you're supposed to be doing. Leave him up to me." You see, this eternal perspective impacts my perspective on how I view people and their circumstances and their attitudes, especially those of whom I have adversity with. Once I begin living with a conscious a conscious awareness that a day is coming that I will have to stand before Christ to be judged for how I lived my life, I'll begin to realize that not only do I not have time to sit and pass judgment on someone else, but I also realize that I am certainly by far not qualified, nowhere close to be qualified to live in judgment of someone else. The Apostle Paul was dealing with some difficult personalities in the church of Corinth. He was dealing with some adversities, severe adversities from other people in relation to them. Well, he had an eternal perspective. His perspective told him that the thing that matters most in all these circumstances is pleasing God. So how is my life reflecting a life that is pleasing to God? Am I living in judgment? The Apostle Paul was reminded himself and also was reminding the Corinthians, look, we're all going to be judged. You're judging me by all these things, all these outward circumstances, but we're all going to be judged. So before you judge me, you better be looking into your own heart, into your own soul. And that leads to the second, or to the next point, as we seek to live a life that is pleasing to God. Refrain from living in judgment of others, but then also live with authenticity. Live with authenticity. Since then we know what it is to fear the Lord, we try to persuade others what we are, who we are, our true selves. All secrets out on the table. Nothing hidden. What we are is plain to God. Why? Because through Jesus Christ, He's going to judge all of men's secrets. Since what we are is plain to God, and then Paul adds, and I hope it is also plain to your conscience. Paul didn't want to live a life with secrets. He wanted to live such a life that was open, that people would not misunderstand his intentions, they would not misjudge him, but he wanted to have a life that was so pleasing to God. He wanted to have a life that when people see him, they see Christ. We're not trying to commend ourselves to you again. Paul is saying, we're not trying to brag. I'm not telling you all this stuff that I've gone through in order to make me look good, but I want you to understand that before you judge my circumstances, you see, there's a bigger context at play here. This whole idea of suffering, there's a bigger purpose behind that. And he was talking about that last week in our message. But they're judging his integrity. They are judging him as a person. There's a bigger context at play here. We're not trying to brag, or we're not trying to commend ourselves to you again, but are giving you an opportunity to take pride in us, so that you can answer those who take pride in what is seen rather than in what is in the heart. Because there are those who want an answer. I'm telling you all this and I'm explaining all this to you so you'll be able to have an answer to those who want to just continue to sit in judgment of me. And not only of me, but just the whole idea of judging others like that. That there is a bigger picture at play. You see, what we are is plain to God, Paul says. To live with such a clear conscience, to live with authenticity, is to live a life with such a clear conscience before God that you would be confident that others would see what God sees. What does God see in you today? And would you be confident, would I be confident, if others saw what God sees? Am I able to point to my life as an example of what an authentic follower of Christ looks like? Apostle Paul did. He says, I want to live my life. I'm pointing these things out in my life because this was, as we talked about last week, it was the power of God in Paul, working in him, that was displayed. That's what Paul wanted people to see. It's not me who endures through all this. It's not me. It is the power of God in me. That's what I want people to see. And so if it seems like I'm coming across proud or boastful, I'm bragging about all the stuff that I'm going through, it is only to highlight the fact that it is not by my power, but it's been through the power of Christ who is in me. So don't judge me. God is at work here. You work on your own life. You work on your own situation and make sure that your heart is clear and clean and free of these secrets. And so Paul was driven with this passion to live a life free from secrets, to be known as God, to be known by others as God knows him. And there's a reason why Paul took this perspective. And it's the next and final point in your notes. The Apostle Paul was gripped by the love of God. As you seek to please God in all of life's circumstances, as you refrain from living in judgment of others, and as you live authentically, as you have searched your own heart and you live in a conscious awareness that you're going to be judged, so therefore you confess, you clear out your heart of anything that is distracting, anything that is meaningless or useless, and you allow God to fill you so that His love can pour through you, His life can be evident in and through you. Make sure that nothing distracts you. Make sure that what grips us is the love of God. For we, Paul says, are out of our mind, as some say. If we are out of our mind, as some say, it is for God. And Paul was being accused, man, you're just crazy. Well, you know what? If it seems like we're out of our mind, it's because we are so gripped by the love of God. If we are in our right mind, if we are able to gain any composure, we do so for your sake, so that we can explain and teach you. For Christ's love compels us, because we are convinced that one died for all. And therefore all died. And He died for all, that those who live should no longer, what does that say? Read that with me, church. Live for themselves, but for Him who died for them and was raised again. The word there is sunako in the Greek. In the original, it means literally to hold together. That word compel. It literally means to hold together with constraint, to compress. It is an illustration, is a word that would be used to describe a bowl that is, well, going to become a steer. You all know what I mean, right? I was helping out on the farm one day, and first time I've done this, but they were going to make a steer that day. And glad I was not that bowl. But they had this contraption, and it was a steel contraption, and they led that bull into that, and then they clamped it down. That bull was clamped. And from that point, they proceeded with a procedure that I don't even want to talk about or mention. But that bull was in so much pain as he was going through this transformation. But no matter how bad it hurts, how uncomfortable it was, he was gripped. He could not move. He could not assert his own will. He was gripped, and that's the word that is used here to describe when Paul says the love of Christ constrains me. It compels me. It grips me so hard. Even though no matter how much pain, how much difficulty I'm going through, it is the love of Christ that holds me, and I cannot break free from that. And so if you think I'm a nut, it is this love that is so strong and so powerful. It's the same word that Jesus used in Luke's Gospel chapter 12 when He says, but I have a baptism to be baptized with, and He's talking about His suffering, His crucifixion, and how I am held by it until it is accomplished, how I am gripped by it. I am occupied. I am under the control of. Are we so gripped by God's love in this way, church? Am I? Or are there other motives? Are there other attitudes that have a tighter grip than the love of God? Are there those things that our personal preferences, or those strongholds from our past, our traditions or whatever, those things that distract us from the mission, that we are held in one way by the message of Christ, that we love, we want to go to heaven, we want to see our church grow, and everything else, but then something else that is stronger comes along and moves us away from that. We easily break free from that because it doesn't have that strong of a hold on us. Does that make sense? What other things, other than the love of God, grips us? For the Apostle Paul, being gripped by the love of God made a difference in the midst of adversity with others. And so from now on, we regard no one. We recognize, we value no one based on the flesh. In accordance with, in relation to the outward circumstances of our life, we regard people only in relation to the one who died for them, as living for him or else needing him. We view people, we view them as living for Christ or else we view people as needing Christ. Paul says, from now on, we regard no one based on the flesh, on the outward circumstances, even though we have known Christ based on the flesh. Paul is speaking of personal experience. For Paul once viewed Jesus after the flesh. He judged Jesus after the flesh. He saw Jesus as a threat to Judaism, as a threat to his own Jewish faith, and he did all that he could to stomp it out. Paul says, I once knew Christ, judged Christ based on the flesh. Paul obviously misjudged Jesus. Nevertheless, now we know him, now we no longer are knowing him thus. So if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old things passed away. Behold, new things have come into being. Again, just as last week, we have that creation language signifying the power of God to create, to recreate, to renew, to restore. I don't look at anybody anymore after the flesh. I don't judge them because I recognize that there is more than what I'm seeing on the surface of why this person is being the way they are, acting the way they are. There's probably some secret hurts. There's some underlying things that are wounds that are still open. But I don't judge them based on the flesh, because in Christ, they can become a new creation. In Christ, all the old sins, all the past wounds can be healed and cleansed, and all things can become new. As Oswald Chambers said, I dare not lose hope for anyone when once I discern what lies within me apart from the grace of God. Where would you be if it weren't for grace this morning? I don't know. Brother Mark, would you have something this morning? Brother Mark's going to come and he'll lead us in a song. And I don't know, maybe if God might be speaking to you. I want to give you opportunity to respond. The marvelous grace of Christ in our life. If God is speaking to you, and I'm confident that He is. Now, He may not be speaking to us in such a degree that we feel compelled to come this morning and to pray. I hope and trust that you're going to pray right where you're at. You're praying right now. God is speaking to you that you're responding even before you move, that you're responding in your heart, in your mind. But maybe you're here today and you need to make it a little bit more significant in stepping out and coming and praying. We want to pray with you. And if that's you this morning, I would invite you to do so. I invite you to stand. Brother Mark, where are we going to be at? 467. Higher ground.